Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Rebecca Keppel. In today's video, we're going to be talking all about embossing powders and heat embossing, and I've got 7 different ways to use embossing powders in your card making. I love doing videos like this where you take basic supplies and use them in lots of fun ways. If you like seeing videos like that, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel down below. But for now, let's jump into 7 different ways to use embossing powder and plenty of tips and tricks along the way. Be sure to stick around until the end because I answer a question that a lot of people have asked, which is, can you use Distress Oxide inks with embossing powder? First, let's take a look at the basic supplies that I really like using for heat embossing. First is my favorite embossing ink, which is Versamark. There are several different companies that make embossing ink, but I've always been successful using Versamark, so I've never felt the need to try anything else. But if you have good outcomes with a different embossing ink, that's great too. Next is the anti-static powder, which is a game changer for heat embossing. I started out using the EK Success tool, but the tiny brush was kind of a pain to use for large areas, so I switched over to the anti-static powder bag. The only downside to the bag is that excess powder that always seems to come out of it, so I just purchased this large fan brush from Tonic Studios for sweeping that away. I was very happy with how this worked out, and it will be part of my embossing routine from here on out. Lots of companies make embossing powders, and I wanted to be sure to showcase a bunch in this video. So I'll be using powders from Tonic Studios, Wow, Stampendous, Simon Says Stamp, Ranger, Gina K Designs, Imagine Crafts, and Hero Arts. For large quantities of powder, like for white and clear, I use Jennifer McGuire's storage method of these little containers with small spoons attached to the lid by cable hooks. I've had this heat tool for years and it's still kicking. It gets super hot quickly and does a great job of melting the embossing powder without blowing it all over the place. Often I use coffee filters to catch the embossing powder and to help me pour it back in. I've had this pack for years because I reuse them quite a bit. Most of the time when I'm using heat embossing, I'm using them for sentiments. So sometimes I like to kind of step out of that and create a really pretty heat embossed background. I especially like the look of a pearly embossing powder on a colorful cardstock. I have a 6x6 piece of cardstock in my MISTI, and I'm treating it with anti-static powder from the powder bag. You can see the powder really gets everywhere, so I'm going to sweep the excess away with the Tonic Studios fan brush, which really works like a charm. And then I ink up my 6x6 background stamp with Versamark ink and stamp it down. It can be helpful when you're stamping to swipe over the door of the MISTI with a cloth so that you can get really even, smooth pressure all over the front of the MISTI. I'm going to use Hero Arts White Satin Pearl Embossing Powder on top. Since we used anti-static powder, a little flick to the back gets any of the excess embossing powder off. You can see when the embossing powder melts, it creates a pretty pearl tone-on-tone effect. We'll turn this background into a card after heat embossing some sentiments. If you are heat embossing sentiments, sometimes it's fun to really mix up the medium. And yes, you can heat emboss on vellum and acetate. When embossing on vellum, it's important to use a high-quality, heavy vellum. I'm using Simon Says Stamp vellum, which is a 40-pound vellum. You can see it's thick and sturdy. In order to line my sentiment up in the center, I place the vellum in my mini MISTI and then place the Simon Says Stamp Grid Transparency on top. I place the Waffle Flower Essential Sentiment stamp that says Merry Christmas in the center of the grid and close the MISTI door to pick the stamp up and then remove the transparency. Now it's time to treat the vellum with anti-static powder. I like to treat the whole piece of vellum because vellum is very staticky and the embossing powder wants to try and stick everywhere. I brush off the excess anti-static powder and then ink up the stamp with Versamark ink and stamp it. I'm using Gina K's Rose Gold Embossing Powder, and you can see how effective the anti-static powder is, even on the vellum. To melt the powder, be sure your heat tool is super hot, and then only hold the heat tool to the vellum for a few seconds at a time so as not to melt or scorch the vellum. To emboss acetate, you'll need some type of embossable plastic sheet. I'm using Judikins and have had great results with this product. I'm going to stamp the same sentiment this time in the middle of the acetate. So again, use anti-static all over the acetate because this is even more staticky than the vellum, if you can believe that. Brush away the excess anti-static powder and stamp with Versamark ink. It's helpful to use a stamp positioner when stamping on acetate to prevent any smearing. I'm pouring the Tonic Studios Detailed Embossing Powder in classic silver on top. Don't panic if a bunch seems to stick to the acetate. Once you turn it over and tap on the back, most of that should come off since we really treated it well with a ton of anti-static powder. If you still have some stragglers, you can use a dry paintbrush to wipe them away. You want to melt the powder just as we did with the vellum, a super hot heat tool, and not holding it on the acetate for long periods of time to avoid melting it. To combine the embossed backgrounds with these special sentiments, I die cut circles out of the panels. To hide the adhesive, I'm sandwiching the acetate between rose gold metallic cardstock and the die cut panel. For the vellum, I layer it in between silver glitter cardstock and the die cut panel. A fun way to create a super shiny background is to heat emboss a metallic embossing powder on a foiled cardstock. Some of you may remember how much I am loving the Memory Box polished foil pad. I'm placing a piece of the blue foil paper in my MISTI and treating it with a ton of anti-static powder and then brushing the excess away. And then I'm going to stamp up a background stamp with Versamark ink. And I am using a Simon Says stamp background stamp in my original MISTI, so I took out the foam of the MISTI so that I could stamp this big background stamp. Once I'm done with that, I am using the Tonic Studios Classic Silver Detail Embossing Powder poured on top. You can see this is also a very sticky paper, so it requires a few extra taps on the back, but ultimately we get great coverage just on the stamped image because of all that anti-static powder that we used. This is such a thin paper that I was really nervous about holding the heat tool on it for too long, but it really held up well. It takes a while to emboss a whole background like this, and it started to curl. So I decided to set it down onto my waffle flower water media mat to finish melting the powder, and that helps straighten it out. You can absolutely emboss on this mat because it is heat resistant up to 440 degrees. To complete this card, I cut the panel down to 4 by 5 1/4 and matted it onto silver glitter cardstock. Then I die cut the waffle flower oversized piece word die in glitter silver cardstock as well and adhered it with liquid glue to the panel. I chose a sub-sentiment from the matching stamp set and treated a scrap of the blue foil paper with anti-static powder and stamped the sub-sentiment with Versamark ink. I used the same Tonic Studios embossing powder that I used for the background, and I was very happy with how well the detail powder works on sentiments. I popped up the sentiment strip on foam tape, and I love all the shine and shimmer on this otherwise very simple card. An older technique that I haven't done in a while but I really love is using clear embossing powder as a resist to inking. I love how you get a completely different look if you use it on white cardstock or colorful cardstock. I'm using the Waffle Flower Blossoms stamp set for this technique because it has a really detailed bouquet perfect for a resist technique. First, I'm going to work on the A2 white cardstock panel, which I'll treat with anti-static powder and wipe away the excess with the brush. You know the drill by now, stamp with Versamark ink. This time, I'm going to pour the Imagine Crafts embossing powder in clear matte on top. I love that their embossing powder comes in these small bags because they make it really easy to return the excess back inside. It's hard to tell on camera, but in person you can see how the embossing powder turns from that sugary look to a clear yet matte finish when melted. Next, we're going to do the same exact process on pink cardstock. Use anti-static powder, brush away the excess, stamp the same stamp with Versamark ink, and pour the same clear matte embossing powder on top. This time, it's easier to see where the embossing powder is melting. I love how the stamped image looks darkened by the Versamark and the embossing powder on the pink cardstock. Now, to use the clear embossing powder as a resist, simply ink blend on top. Starting with the pink, I'm going to use Distress Oxide Worn Lipstick, starting at about the middle of the card. The bottom of the card, I'm going to leave the color of the cardstock. Then I'm going to blend some carved pumpkin Distress Oxide towards the top. To reveal the heat emboss details, use a microfiber towel or dry paper towel to brush off the ink off of the embossed image. I used it to blend out the line between the colors too. I love how you can see the original pink of the floral image in the orange and the darker pink blended areas. For the white cardstock, I used a diagonal blend of squeezed lemonade, twisted citron, and tumbled glass. This time, when you buff away the ink, you can see the white lines of the floral image because that clear embossing powder trapped the white cardstock underneath and resisted the ink. To create the sentiment, I'm stamping on an 8-inch piece of Simon Says stamp vellum and pouring white embossing powder on top. Then I cut the strip lengthwise so that there are several inches on either side. I place the strip over my card to determine where I want the sentiment to go, then flip it over and fold one side in towards the center. Then I can place adhesive on the folded tab. Whoops, I almost adhered it upside down. Once I have that side stuck down, I can flip the card over again and put adhesive on the other side of the vellum that is sticking out, fold it in, and stick it down in the back of the card. I'm going to do the same thing with the other resist card. This time I embossed with silver. The sentiments are both from the same Waffle Flower Blossom stamp set that the floral image was from. I love this combination of vellum heat embossed sentiment with resist heat embossed inked backgrounds. Whether it's for the holidays or a super special celebration, I love gift tags that look like they've been dipped in gold. This is really easy to recreate with embossing powder. I die cut this large dotted tag die from white cardstock and treated it with anti-static powder. Then I brushed off the excess powder. Then take the Versamark ink pad and place it at an angle down onto the tag and press down and swipe all the way down to the bottom. Working on the water media mat makes this really easy because it's so smooth and the excess ink can be washed off since the mat is non-stick. Pour gold embossing powder on top. I'm using Stampendous. Such a thick application is going to take a little time to melt, so be sure to take the heat tool off the tag every few seconds so as not to scorch the tag. It's really amazing how easy it is to create such a stunning look. I'm definitely going to make several of these for Christmas presents this year. If you've never tried mixing your own color of embossing powder, I definitely recommend giving it a try. I had a color that I wasn't using very much, so I mixed it with a little bit of white to create a speckled look, and I really love the effect. I really like this navy embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp, but I don't tend to use colors that often, so I thought it might be fun to create a new color with it. I'm using a bead tray to mix in because I bought a whole pack of these and it's big enough for me to see what I'm doing. So I just pour a little of the navy in and then a spoon or two of white and then mix it up until it seems like it's completely combined. I have a light blue A2 piece of cardstock in my mini MISTI that I'm treating with anti-static powder and brushing away the excess. Then I'm stamping a design of heart stamps, which are also from Simon Says Stamp, in Versamark ink. Then I just pour my mixed embossing powders on top until I cover all of my stamped hearts. I love how unique the mix of powders looks. I know some companies sell mixes like this, but if you have colors you're not using, it can be fun to experiment a bit. Love how they look when they're melted as well. Another question I've gotten is whether or not embossing powders can get old and go bad. While we had hearts all designed in the MISTI, I thought I would try out a very old jar of embossing powder. After stamping the hearts the same way I did before, but this time on white cardstock, I'm pouring Pink Ranger embossing powder on top. This powder is somewhere between 7 and 10 years old. I had no problems getting the embossing powder to stick to the embossing ink, so far so good. I also heat set it as normal. I've read that sometimes people have trouble with really old metallic embossing powders, so if you're struggling with an embossing powder and it's not looking right, I guess that could be the issue, but as for me, I've not found any problems with older embossing powders. To finish this card off, I stamped and heat embossed a sentiment using the Wow embossing powder. One of the reasons I tend to shy away from using dark colors of embossing powder is that it's difficult to avoid stray bits of powder sticking where you don't want them. If even a dry brush isn't doing the trick, try tapping the brush on your anti-static powder bag first. That seemed to help me get rid of some of those remnants. For the custom mix card, I stamped and heat embossed a sentiment in silver. Just try and avoid getting too much heat on the area that you've already melted. And definitely be sure to let everything cool before touching it or putting it underneath anything. I learned that the hard way after smearing something I had worked really hard on. Last but not least, because I talk about Distress Oxide inks a lot, I've had many crafters ask me if you can use them to heat emboss. So let's check it out. I'm going to follow the same process that I've followed for all the other embossed panels, using anti-static powder and the brush to sweep off the excess. I'm using one of the Simon Says stamp hearts again. This time I'm going to stamp it with Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. I'm using the Misty because I want to be able to double or triple stamp the image so that it's completely covered, and so I can make sure that the image doesn't dry out too fast. Distress Oxide ink isn't sticky the way that Versamark is, so I need to pour the embossing powder on quickly before the image dries. I'm using the Stampendous clear embossing powder so that you will be able to see the ink color underneath. It looks like the powder stuck to the image, and when I melt the embossing powder, you can see that the heart has a glossy, shiny layer to it. So it looks like, yes, you can technically emboss with Distress Oxides. I'm going to try several other colors to make sure they work as well. Starting with Squeezed Lemonade. Now, it's probably true that you would get a thicker, more even coverage of the embossing powder using a coat of Versamark over the Distress Oxide ink once it was dry. But if you're just looking for a slightly glossy coverage or to seal the Distress Oxide ink, this method works fine. I did the same with Twisted Citron and Tumbled Glass, and they all worked equally well. I love the glossy effect that the heat embossing has on top of the stamping. To finish this card, I stamped a Thinking of You sentiment from Waffle Flower's Essential Sentiments stamp set in Gina K Black Amalgam ink. Once I got a little ink on the side, I decided to cut this panel down. Then I cut a piece of fun foam slightly smaller than the panel and adhered the fun foam to an A2 piece of black cardstock and the panel on top of the fun foam to pop it up evenly. I added a few Gina K rainbow heart embellishments adhered with liquid glue to embellish it, and I love the look of the embossed Distress Oxide ink. I hope this video inspired you to take out your embossing powders and use them in lots of fun ways. If you'd like to see some other videos where I share creative ways to use basic supplies, I'll have them linked over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit that bell so you can be notified every time I have a new video available. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon.